The wind in the high desert of New Mexico territory had a name for every kind of sorrow. It whispered through the skeletal branches of juniper and scrub oak, carrying the dust of forgotten trails and the scent of distant rain that never fell. Eli Sutton knew its language. For 5 years, it had been his only constant companion, its lonely howl a fitting sermon for the empty church of his life. His ranch was less a home and more a foothold against the vast, unforgiving expanse that stretched from the foothills of the Sangre de Cristos to the flat, hazy horizon. It was a place of rock and grit, where water was a prayer and shade a miracle. The cabin he had built with his own hands sat hunkered against a low mesa, its log walls silvered by sun and scoured by wind. Inside, the silence was as thick as the dust on the floorboards. It was a silence carved in the shape of a woman named Sarah, and the small, still babe she had taken with her into the frozen earth 5 winters ago. Eli was 34, but the years had plowed deep furrows at the corners of his eyes and mouth. The war had taught him how to kill and how to endure, but it was Sarah's death that had taught him how to be truly alone. He had buried her himself, chipping at the iron-hard ground until his hands were raw. The preacher's words lost to the same wind that now rattled his windows. After that, he turned his back on the town of Las Lloronas Creek and on the God who presided over its small, whitewashed church. People were a complication, faith a fool's bargain. He had his cattle, thin and tough as whipcord, the endless work of the ranch, and the ghosts that kept watch with him in the long, dark hours before dawn. He preferred it that way. The raw, physical ache of labor was an honest pain. It demanded nothing but his sweat and left him too tired to dream. He mended fences that the wind seemed determined to flatten, rode for days checking on his scattered herd, and spoke only to his horse, a stoic buckskin gelding named Jed. His world was small, contained, and blessedly quiet. He had built his walls high and strong, and for 5 years, no one had tried to breach them. Then she came. She appeared as a shimmer of heat and dust on the long track that led to his cabin, a solitary figure moving with a slow, exhausted gait. As she drew closer, he saw she was a woman, though the desert had done its best to unmake her. Her dress, a plain gray calico, was caked with the red dust of the trail, the hem frayed and torn. A bonnet, limp and sun-bleached, failed to hide the stray wisps of brown hair plastered to her temples with sweat. He watched from the porch, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle that always leaned against the doorframe. He was not a welcoming man, and his land offered no charity. She stopped a respectful distance from the porch steps, her hands clutching a small, battered carpet bag as if it were her last anchor in a hostile world. She did not look up at him immediately, but instead took a moment to draw a ragged breath, her shoulders rising and falling with the effort. When she finally raised her head, her eyes met his. They were the color of a faded sky, and held a depth of shame so profound it seemed to have extinguished any light within them. "Sir," she said, her voice soft and raspy, little more than a whisper of dry leaves. "My name is Clara Mercer. I am looking for work." Eli said nothing. He simply stared, his gaze hard and assessing. He saw the tremble in her hands, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. She was a bird with a broken wing, and he wanted no part of it. Wounded things drew predators. "Ain't no work here," he said, his voice a low growl unused to conversation. "Keep moving." She flinched at the harshness of his tone, but she did not move. Her gaze dropped to her own hands, and he saw they were chapped and red, the knuckles swollen, the skin scarred with the kind of abuse that came not from a man's fist, but from lye soap and scrub brushes. "I can cook," she offered quietly. "I can clean, mend, tend a garden. I am strong. I do not need payment in coin, just a place to stay. Some food. I will not be a burden." He saw the desperation clinging to her like the dust on her dress. But beneath it, there was something else, a thread of steel. She was not begging. She was offering a trade, the only one she had left to make. He had seen beggars before, in the war and in the towns. Their eyes were different. Hers were filled with shame. Yes, but not with submission. "Where are you from?" he asked, more to find a reason to send her away than from any real curiosity. "From a town called Harmony, east of here," she said, her eyes still fixed on her hands. "My husband, he passed. There was a fire." The words hung in the air between them, spare and heavy. A church fire. He would learn later. One blamed on her husband's drunken carelessness. A congregation that had prayed with her on Sunday had cast her out by Monday. Her husband's family had turned their backs, leaving her with nothing but his name, a name that was now synonymous with disgrace. She was a widow, an outcast, a woman utterly alone. Eli's mind, the cold, practical part of him, screamed at him to send her away. She was trouble. A woman like that, a walking tragedy, would unravel the tight, hard knot of his solitude. But another part of him, a part he thought long dead and buried with Sarah, stirred with a reluctant flicker of something akin to pity. It was the sight of her hands, hands that had clearly worked themselves to the bone, likely scrubbing the floors of the very church that had condemned her. He saw a quiet endurance in her that resonated with his own. They were both survivors, just of different kinds of wars. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of it loud in the afternoon stillness. "There's a room in the back," he said, the words feeling foreign and rusty in his mouth. "It ain't much." Clara Mercer's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a disbelief so raw it was painful to witness. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She did not weep or offer effusive thanks. She simply nodded, a small, jerky motion of her head, and whispered, "Thank you, sir. God bless you." Eli grunted, turning away from the gratitude in her eyes. "God ain't got nothing to do with it," he muttered, pushing the cabin door open. "The well is out back. Supper is at sundown. The work starts at sunrise." He led her into the dim, cool interior of the cabin. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. The main room was sparse, containing a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and his own cot in the corner. He led her past it to a second door, one he had not opened in 5 years. The air that met them was stale and thick with the dust of memory. It had been meant for the baby. A small crib, one he had spent weeks carving, stood in the corner, shrouded in a canvas sheet. A rocking chair sat beside it, silent and waiting. Sarah's sewing basket was on a small table, a piece of linen still folded within it, needles still threaded. For a moment, the ghost of his past was so strong he could almost smell the lavender scent of his wife's hair. The pain was a physical blow, sharp and sudden, stealing his breath. He saw Clara's gaze fall upon the crib, and a flicker of understanding, of shared sorrow, passed through her eyes. She said nothing. "It's yours," he said gruffly, stepping back into the main room, needing to escape the suffocating weight of the past. "Stay out of my way. That's all I ask." He left her there and went outside, back to the honest, uncomplicated world of his work. But as he saddled Jed, he knew something had irrevocably changed. The silence of his cabin was no longer empty. It now held the quiet breathing of a woman and the heavy weight of her shame. The walls he had built around himself had been breached, not by force, but by a quiet request and a pair of haunted, sky-blue eyes. For 3 days, a strange and fragile peace settled over the ranch. Clara was as quiet as a shadow, moving through the cabin with a determined efficiency that slowly began to push back at the years of neglect. The grime disappeared from the windows. The floor was swept clean, and the scent of baking bread, something Eli had not smelled in 5 years, began to fill the small space. She spoke only when necessary, Her voice always soft, her eyes always downcast. She worked from before the sun rose until long after it set, as if trying to scrub away her past with sheer physical labor. Eli kept his distance, spending his days out on the range, finding comfort in the vast emptiness and the familiar rhythms of his work. Yet, he was aware of her presence in 1,000 small ways. The clean shirt laid out on his cot, the warm meal waiting for him on the table, the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere from a place of stark survival to something that faintly resembled a home. It was unsettling. It was a comfort he did not want and did not trust. He found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking, noting the graceful economy of her movements, the persistent sadness that clung to her like a shroud. Then, on the 4th day, another person appeared on the horizon. This one was different. There was no slow, weary approach. This figure rode a tired-looking mare, but sat astride it with a straight-backed confidence that was anything but defeated. As she drew closer, Eli saw a splash of color, a dress of gaudy, flower-printed fabric, a hat with a wilting feather stuck in the band. She was not a woman broken by the desert. She was a woman who dared it to try. She rode right up to the porch and dismounted with a weary but theatrical sigh, her movements fluid and self-aware. She was younger than Clara, perhaps by a decade, and built on a more generous scale. Her curves were pronounced, her hair a wild mane of dark auburn that had escaped its pins. Her face was flushed from the sun, dotted with a few defiant freckles across the bridge of her nose. She smelled of whiskey, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of crushed wildflowers. "This Sutton's place?" she asked, her voice a husky drawl that was entirely out of place in the thin, dry air. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, took him in with a frank, appraising stare that missed nothing, from the scuff of his boots to the weary lines around his mouth. Eli nodded, his hand once again finding its way to the rifle stock. "Who's asking?" "The name's Maybelle Rose," she said, giving the horse's reins a pat. "I've had a hell of a trip to get to this godforsaken place, and I could use a drink of water that ain't half mud." The cabin door creaked open, and Clara appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of the newcomer, taking in the flamboyant dress, the brazen posture, the whole unapologetic spectacle of the woman standing before them. A faint blush of disapproval colored Clara's cheeks. Maybelle's green eyes flickered to Clara, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. It was not a friendly smile. It was a smile that acknowledged the vast, unbridgeable gulf between their two worlds. Eli gestured toward the well. "Water's there. The road is that way." Maybelle ignored him. She looked past him, into the cabin, her gaze lingering on the tidy room, the simmering pot on the hearth. "Looks like you got yourself a housekeeper," she observed, her tone laced with a sardonic edge. "You in the market for any other kind of help?" Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her throat as she understood the woman's insinuation. Her face, already pale, turned ashen. Eli's jaw tightened. "State your business, miss, or get to riding." Maybelle laughed, a low, throaty sound. "My business is a man named Frank Miller, a fiancé, by mail, supposed to be working a claim near here. I traveled 1,000 miles to marry the man, only to find out he got himself shot dead in a card game the day before my train pulled in. So you see, Mr. Sutton, my business is shot to hell, along with my prospects." She delivered the story without a hint of self-pity, just a weary, cynical pragmatism. She was a woman who had gambled and lost, and was now surveying her bleak new reality. "That's a shame," Eli said, his voice flat. "But it's got nothing to do with me." "Maybe it does," she countered, taking a step closer. Her scent was stronger now, a heady mix of sinner and saint. "I got no money, no kin, and nowhere to go. The good people of Las Lloronas Creek made it clear a woman like me ain't welcome without a man to vouch for her. So, I'm left with what I came with. Myself. She paused, her green eyes boring into his. I got no home, no morals left, and nothing to trade but what men want. The declaration was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of their existence. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the incessant whisper of the wind. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of shock and horror. This was the very picture of fallen womanhood she had been taught to fear and despise, a creature of blatant, transactional carnality. It was temptation given flesh, walking brazenly into their sanctuary of quiet shame. Eli felt a muscle twitch in his cheek. He had seen women like her in the towns the army had passed through, women left behind by war and poverty, selling the only thing they had left. But he had never had one show up on his doorstep. Her bluntness was a shock, but it was also, in a strange way, honest. She was not pretending to be anything she was not. He should have sent her away. Every rational thought, every instinct for self-preservation, told him to point her down the trail and forget he ever saw her. His life was complicated enough, but when he looked at her, he saw past the brazen words and the come-hither smile. He saw the bone-deep weariness in her eyes, the faint tremor of fear in the hand that rested on her hip. She was just as lost as Clara, just as alone. She had simply chosen a different shield to hide behind, pride and piety for one, defiance and carnality for the other. "The barn loft is empty," he heard himself say, the words tasting like a mistake even as he spoke them. "You can stay there, for now. There's a blanket and some straw. It's better than sleeping with the coyotes." Maybelle's mask of cynical confidence wavered for just a second. A flicker of surprise, maybe even relief, crossed her face before she caught it. She gave a short, sharp nod. "The barn loft it is," she said, her voice a little softer than before. "Don't worry. I know how to keep to my own side of the fence." As Maybelle led her weary horse toward the barn, Eli turned and saw Clara still standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Her eyes, when they met his, were full of a question he could not answer, and a judgment he felt he probably deserved. That night, the tension in the small cabin was a living thing. It coiled in the corners and thickened the air, making it hard to breathe. Eli sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. The familiar, methodical movements a comfort in the unsettling new quiet. Clara moved about the hearth, her back ramrod straight, every line of her body radiating a tense, righteous indignation. From the barn came the faint sound of Maybelle humming a saloon tune, a melody of cheap perfume and easier morals drifting on the night air. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the only light came from a single flickering lantern, the cabin seemed to shrink, trapping them in their separate silences. The lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the log walls, shadows that seemed to whisper and writhe. Eli lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, acutely aware of the two women who now inhabited his solitary world. He could hear the soft, even breathing of Clara from the back room, a sound of fragile, sleeping piety, and in his mind, he could see the vibrant, defiant form of Maybelle, curled up in the hayloft, a wildflower blooming in the dust. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. But for the first time in 5 years, it was not the only voice in the darkness. The silence within the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken longings of a woman who craved a name, the defiant desires of a woman who offered her body, and the reluctant stirring of a man who had sworn he wanted nothing at all. The arrival of Maybelle Rose was like a lit match tossed into a dry wood box, where Clara's presence was a quiet, steady glow. Like the first light of dawn, Maybelle was a bonfire, crackling, unpredictable, and throwing off a dangerous, alluring heat. The delicate equilibrium of the ranch shattered. Maybelle treated the barn loft not as a refuge, but as a stage. She worked. Eli had to give her that. She mucked out the stall, hauled water for her horse, and even helped him patch a section of broken corral fence. Her movements surprisingly strong and efficient. But she did everything with a theatrical flair, a self-awareness that seemed designed to provoke. She would sing bawdy saloon songs while she worked, her husky voice carrying across the yard, causing Clara to press her lips together in a tight, thin line inside the cabin. Her most potent weapon was her own body, and she wielded it with the skill of a seasoned campaigner. The mornings became a trial for Eli. He would be at the wash basin outside the cabin door, splashing cold water on his face to chase away the ghosts of the night, when Maybelle would emerge from the barn, stretching with a languid, feline grace that pulled her cheap dress tight across her bosom and hips. One morning, she brought her own bucket and basin and set it up not 10 feet from him. "Morning, Eli," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Mind if I borrow your scenery?" Before he could answer, she began to unbutton the top of her dress. Clara, who was shaking out a rug on the porch, froze mid-shake. Eli turned his back, focusing with sudden, intense interest on a loose nail on the cabin wall. "Don't be shy on my account." Maybelle's voice purred from behind him. "I don't mind being seen. A body's just a body. After all, nothing to be ashamed of." He could hear the splash of water, the sound of a cloth against skin. He gritted his teeth, the image of her bare shoulders, the curve of her neck, blooming unbidden in his mind. He was a man who had lived like a monk for 5 years, his desires buried deep beneath layers of grief and hard labor. Maybelle was systematically excavating them, bringing them to the surface whether he wanted them there or not. He finished his washing in a rush and stalked off toward the pastures, the sound of her soft humming following him like a taunt. Inside the cabin, Clara felt a storm of emotions she could not name. She was ashamed for Maybelle's shamelessness, ashamed for the flicker of heat she felt in her own cheeks, ashamed for the way her eyes had been drawn to the scene against her will. This was sin, plain and simple. It was the weakness of the flesh made manifest, the very thing her old pastor had preached against with such fire and fury. But beneath the judgment, something else stirred. It was a sliver of envy, sharp and painful. Maybelle moved with a freedom Clara had never known. She spoke her mind, took up space, and seemed utterly unburdened by the opinions of others. She had been abandoned and left with nothing, yet she did not cower. She faced the world with her chin up, her gaze direct. Clara, who had spent her life trying to be good, to be quiet, to be invisible, felt a confusing, forbidden curiosity. What would it be like to walk through the world like that? To not be perpetually apologizing for one's own existence, to see a man's gaze and not flinch from it. She would watch Maybelle from the window, her hands kneading dough with a punishing force, her mind a turmoil of scripture and nascent, dangerous thoughts. Eli threw himself into his work, seeking refuge in the vast, silent landscapes of his ranch. He rode for hours, pushing himself and his horse to the point of exhaustion, hoping to leave the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin behind. He told himself it was about the cattle, about the fences, about the endless list of chores, but he knew he was running. He was running from the scent of baking bread that now filled his home, and from the scent of wildflowers and whiskey that haunted his barn. He was running from the sight of Clara's trembling hands as she served him dinner, and from the memory of Maybelle's challenging green eyes. But the high desert was a place of sudden, violent moods. The sky could be a placid, cloudless blue one moment and a churning cauldron of bruised purple clouds the next. The summer monsoons arrived without warning, turning the dry arroyos into raging torrents. It was during one of these sudden, furious storms that Eli's world was forced to contract. The sky broke open in the late afternoon while he and Maybelle were on the far side of the creek, rounding up a few stray yearlings. The rain came not in drops, but in sheets, a solid wall of water that soaked them to the skin in seconds. Thunder cracked directly overhead, the sound so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. "The creek!" Eli yelled over the roar of the storm. "We need to get the horses across before it floods." They spurred their mounts toward the crossing, but it was already too late. The normally placid Las Lloronas Creek was transforming into a muddy, churning beast, its waters rising with terrifying speed. Maybelle's mare, spooked by the thunder and the rising water, lost its footing on the slick rocks. The horse went down with a terrified scream, tossing Maybelle into the torrent. Without a second thought, Eli leaped from Jed's back, grabbing for her. The current was a powerful, unseen hand, pulling at them, trying to drag them downstream. He caught a fistful of her dress, his boots finding a precarious purchase on the rocky creek bed. He hauled her back toward the bank, his muscles straining against the flood. She came up sputtering and terrified, her brazen mask washed away by the raw, elemental fear of the water. For a moment, she clung to him, her body trembling violently against his. He got her back on her feet on the muddy bank and managed to calm her horse, pulling the frightened animal to safety. They were both drenched, shivering, and caked in mud. The ride back to the cabin was a miserable, silent affair, the fury of the storm matching the turmoil in Eli's chest. Clara must have seen them coming. The cabin door flew open as they stumbled into the yard. Her face was a canvas of alarm. "Dear Lord," she breathed, rushing forward. She herded them inside, her usual reserve replaced by a brisk, maternal efficiency. "Get out of those wet things, both of you," she commanded, stoking the fire in the hearth until it blazed. She handed Maybelle a rough-spun blanket, her expression a mixture of concern and a deep, ingrained disapproval of the way the wet dress clung to the other woman's body. Then she turned to Eli. He had already stripped off his soaked shirt and stood bare-chested by the fire, the heat raising steam from his skin. Clara stopped, a towel in her hands, her gaze falling on the hard planes of his chest and the web of old scars that crisscrossed his shoulders. Her breath hitched. "Here," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She stepped forward and began to dry his back and shoulders with the towel. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firmer, as if she were tending to a piece of fragile, priceless porcelain. Eli stood rigid, every muscle tensed. It was the first time a woman had touched him with such tenderness in 5 years. The feeling was so foreign, so overwhelming. It was almost painful. Her hands were gentle, but he could feel the slight tremor in them. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her face, her eyes wide and focused, a faint flush high on her cheekbones. In that moment, she was not the timid, shamed widow. She was simply a woman, looking at a man. Maybelle watched them from across the room, wrapped in her blanket. Her green eyes narrowed and unreadable. The air in the cabin was thick with things unsaid, with the steam rising from their clothes and the heat from the fire and the electric charge of a boundary being crossed. That night, sleep offered Eli no escape. He dreamed. He was standing in the middle of his cabin, and the walls were made of shifting fog. Clara was there, her hands fluttering near his chest, her voice a trembling whisper, praying for his soul. But when he looked into her eyes, they were not the faded blue of a washed-out sky. They were the brilliant, challenging green of Maybelle Rose. Then the scene shifted, and it was Maybelle in his arms, her body warm and solid against his, her lips seeking his. But when she spoke, her voice was Clara's, soft and full of a quiet, desperate sorrow. The lines between them blurred, their faces and voices and touches merging into a single, confusing, and powerful want. He woke with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs, the scent of rain and bread and wildflowers tangled in his senses. The storm passed, but it had washed away more than just the dust. It had washed away the pretense of distance. The next evening, after Eli had finished his chores, Maybelle found him by the corral, checking the latch on the gate. She leaned against the fence, her arms crossed. The setting sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair. "You saved my life yesterday," she said, her voice devoid of its usual teasing lilt. Eli shrugged, not looking at her. Anyone would have done the same. "Maybe," she said. "But you did." She was quiet for a long moment. I'm not looking for a ring. Eli, I'm not Clara. I don't need a name. And I don't need saving, not the way she does. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. I just want to feel something other than shame for a dead man I never even met. I want to feel a man's weight on me and forget for a few hours that I'm all alone in this world. Her honesty was a punch to the gut. It was a raw, desperate plea, stripped of all artifice. He finally turned to face her, and the look in her eyes was one of profound, aching loneliness. It was a look he knew well. He saw it in his own reflection every morning. Every instinct screamed at him to say yes. The dream, the touch, the long, empty years, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of desire. But he saw the vulnerability beneath her brazen words, and he saw the chasm of his own emptiness. He could not offer her comfort. He was a ruin, and he would only pull her down with him. You don't want me. Not really, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not define. I'm not good. I'm just what's here. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone by the corral as the last light of day bled from the sky. He did not know that Clara had been on the porch, shaking out a tablecloth. He did not know that in the stillness of the evening air, his words and Maybelle's had carried. He did not see the way Clara froze, her hands still, her face pale in the twilight. She heard the raw hunger in Maybelle's voice and the profound, soul-deep weariness in Eli's rejection. She wanted to speak, to call out, to say something. But what? That Maybelle was a sinner? That Eli was a good man who deserved better? The words felt hollow, false. She turned and fled back into the safety of the cabin, her heart a tangled knot of pity, fear, and a strange, protective anger. From that day on, a subtle shift occurred. Clara stopped flinching every time Maybelle spoke. She still disapproved, but her judgment was now tempered with a reluctant understanding. She had overheard a confession, a glimpse into a loneliness that mirrored her own. And so, she began to fight back, not with words, but with actions. She baked bread every day, the warm, yeasty smell a constant, comforting presence that laid claim to the cabin. She found Eli's mending basket and began to repair his worn shirts, her stitches small and perfect. She was reclaiming her space, reasserting her purpose in the quiet, domestic ways she understood. She was making herself essential. But their fragile, self-contained world could not remain isolated forever. Word traveled on the wind, carried by the occasional rider who passed on the main trail, or by the stockman who bought a few of Eli's cattle. The story grew with each telling. The reclusive widower. Eli Sutton had taken in not one, but 2 women, a pious widow and a saloon girl. The whispers started in the general store in Las Lloronas Creek and soon reached the church. Rumors, ugly and insidious, began to flare like heat lightning on the horizon. One afternoon, a buggy rattled up the track to the cabin. It was Pastor Davies, a stern, gray-bearded man who saw sin in every shadow. He refused Eli's offer of water and stood stiffly on the porch, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. Mr. Sutton, he began without preamble, his eyes cold and accusing. I have come on a matter of spiritual urgency. The town is talking. They speak of a scandal at this ranch, of an unholy arrangement. His gaze flickered toward the cabin door, where Clara was a silent, anxious sentinel, and then toward the barn, as if he could feel the taint of Maybelle's presence from a distance. You are creating a nest of iniquity, the pastor declared, his voice rising with righteous fervor. It is an affront to God and to the decent folk of this community. This cannot continue. One of these women must leave. Or, he paused, letting the weight of his ultimatum settle. You must choose one and marry her. Immediately. There is no other way. Pastor Davies's ultimatum hung in the air long after his buggy had disappeared into a cloud of dust. It was not a suggestion, it was a sentence. Banish one, marry the other. The town had drawn its line in the sand, and Eli Sutton's strange household was on the wrong side of it. He felt a familiar, cold anger settle in his gut. It was the same anger he had felt toward the unyielding winter that took his wife, toward the faceless God who allowed it. He would not be dictated to, not by a preacher, and not by the whispers of hypocrites. A few days later, he made his decision. "We're going to town," he announced at breakfast, his voice flat and resolute. "We're low on flour and salt, and coffee." Clara looked up from her plate, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. A flicker of fear, stark and immediate, crossed her face. "To Las Lloronas Creek?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the only town we've got," Eli said, not meeting her eyes. Maybelle, who had been watching them both from across the table, let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, this ought to be a circus," she said, taking a long swallow of her coffee. "You sure about this, Eli? You're parading your two sins right down Main Street for all the good folks to see." "I'm not parading anything," he growled. "I'm buying supplies. We need them to live. You can both stay here if you're afraid." It was a challenge, and both women knew it. For Clara, going to town meant facing the very judgment that had driven her into the wilderness. For Maybelle, it meant confronting the pity and scorn she'd already tasted upon her arrival. But to stay behind felt like an admission of guilt, a concession to the town's verdict. "I'll go," Clara said, her voice small but firm. She lifted her chin, a gesture of defiance that cost her dearly. Maybelle smirked, though there was no humor in it. "If she's going, I'm damn sure going. Wouldn't miss this for the world." The ride into town was a study in silence. Eli sat driving the wagon, his jaw set like granite, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara sat beside him, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She wore her best dress, the same worn gray calico, but she had mended the hem and starched the collar until it was stiff. Maybelle sat in the back, amidst the empty crates, humming a defiant, off-key tune, a splash of color and noise in the tense, gray quiet. As they neared Las Lloronas Creek, the tension in the wagon became a palpable thing. The town was not much, a single dusty street lined with a dozen or so false-fronted buildings. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and a handful of houses. But as their wagon rolled onto the main street, it felt like the whole world had stopped to watch. Windows that had been empty suddenly had faces in them. Men lounging on the porch of the saloon stopped talking and turned to stare. Women sweeping their stoops paused, their brooms held motionless, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and salacious curiosity. The whispers started almost immediately, a low, sibilant sound, like dry leaves skittering across a hard pan. They were not just looking, they were judging, dissecting, condemning. Eli pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Miller's General Store. He got down without a word and turned to help Clara. His hand on her arm was a steady, grounding pressure, but she was trembling like a leaf in a high wind. Maybelle hopped down from the back, landing with a thud that seemed to echo in the unnatural quiet. She stood there for a moment, her hands on her hips, sweeping the street with a gaze that dared anyone to speak their judgment aloud. "Let's get this over with," Eli said, his voice low. The moment they stepped inside the store, the quiet chatter within ceased. The air grew thick and heavy. Mr. Miller, a portly man with a self-important air and a thin, disapproving mouth, stood behind the counter. His wife, a pale, bird-like woman, hovered in the background, her eyes darting nervously between the newcomers and her husband. Eli ignored them all. He walked to the counter and placed his list upon it. "Need these things. Miller." Mr. Miller looked at the list, then at Eli. Then his gaze slid past him to the two women standing just inside the door. He looked at Maybelle with a sneer of contempt, and then his eyes settled on Clara. He knew her story. Everyone did. The disgraced widow. He saw her not as a woman in need, but as a stain upon the town's moral fabric. Clara, desperate to prove her worth, her purpose, stepped forward. "And I need 2 spools of white thread. Mr. Miller, if you please." Her voice was faint, but clear. Mr. Miller's face hardened. He looked directly at her, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "We don't serve your kind here, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "This is a decent, Christian establishment." The words were a physical slap. Clara recoiled as if struck, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. The color drained from her face, leaving it a sickly, mottled white. The other customers in the store, 2 ranch wives and a trapper, looked away, their silence a form of consent. Before Eli could react, a low growl came from behind him. Maybelle took a step forward, her green eyes blazing with a fury that was startling in its intensity. "You sanctimonious old goat," she snarled. "She asked for thread, not your goddamn blessing." Get out of my store," Miller sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "The both of you, harlots, homewreckers." Eli slammed his hand down on the counter. The sound was like a pistol shot, and it made everyone, including Miller, jump. "Fill the order," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now." There was something in his eyes, a memory of the war, a flat, deadly calm that promised violence. Miller hesitated, his bluster deflating under that cold gaze. He swallowed hard, gave a jerky nod, and began to gather the items on the list, his hands fumbling. But the damage was done. Clara had turned and fled the store, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob. Eli finished his business in a tense, simmering silence, paid his due, and carried the supplies out to the wagon. He found Clara standing by the horses, her back to the street, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Maybelle stood beside her, a strange, awkward statue of solidarity, her fury having given way to a grim, weary anger. The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride in. The weight of the town's judgment sat between them, heavy and suffocating. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not a silence of tension, but of grief. Clara had retreated to her room, and the sound of her quiet, muffled weeping was a constant, heartbreaking presence. Eli sat at the table, staring into the flames of the hearth, the shopkeeper's cruel words echoing in his mind. He had taken them to town to defy the whispers, and instead, he had led Clara into an ambush. He could not bear it. He got up, walked to her door, and knocked softly. The weeping stopped. "Clara?" he said. A moment later, the door opened a crack. Her face was swollen, her eyes red-rimmed. "Can I come in?" he asked. She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him to enter. He sat on the edge of the small, hard bed. She stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out into the blackness. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I shouldn't have taken you. I was trying to prove something. It was prideful and foolish." She shook her head, not looking at him. "It wasn't your fault. It's me. It's the name I carry, Mercer. It's a dirty word now. My husband, he shamed us, and I am forever tied to that shame." She turned to him then, her face a portrait of utter desolation. "I just want a name again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "A good name. I want to be able to walk into a store and buy a spool of thread and have the man behind the counter look at me and see just a woman. Not a sinner. Not a disgrace. I just want to be seen as good." Her confession laid her soul bare. It was not about pride or position. It was about the fundamental human need for dignity, for a place in the world where one was not despised. A wave of protectiveness, fierce and unfamiliar, washed over Eli. He stood up and went to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. She flinched at his touch but did not pull away. "You are good, Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "What they see, what they say, that's their blindness, not your soul." She finally broke, the silent tears turning into deep, shuddering sobs. She leaned against him, and he held her, his arms awkward and stiff at first, then more certain. He just held her, patting her back clumsily, as she cried out all the pain and humiliation, not just of that day, but of months of ostracism and loneliness. He held her until the sobs subsided into shivers, and the shivers into a weary calm. He did not know how long they stood there. He knew only that it was the first time he had willingly offered comfort to another human being since Sarah's death, and the first time he had allowed himself to feel another's pain so acutely. Later, much later, he was lying on his cot, staring into the darkness. The cabin was finally quiet. He thought Clara was asleep. He was drifting in that gray space between wakefulness and dream when he heard a floorboard creak. Not in Clara's room, but in the main room. A shadow detached itself from the darkness and moved toward his bed. It was Maybelle. She was barefoot, wearing only a thin chemise that was almost luminous in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. She knelt beside his cot. He could smell the clean, hay scent of her hair. "She asleep?" Maybelle whispered. Eli nodded, his heart beginning to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest. Her touch was cool and deliberate. "You were good with her," she said. "Gentle. I didn't know you had that in you." He did not know what to say. Her hand moved, tracing the line of his jaw. "She wants a name," she whispered, her voice husky. "She wants to be a wife. She wants goodness." She leaned closer, her lips brushing against his ear. "Don't marry me, Eli, just take me." Her other hand found his, her fingers lacing through his. "Just for tonight. Let me be something more than the mail-order bride of a dead man." He should have sent her away. He should have remembered the pastor's warning, the town's scorn, the sleeping woman in the next room. But his defenses had been worn down by the day's events, by Clara's raw sorrow, and by the profound, aching loneliness that now radiated from the woman kneeling beside him. Her plea was not about carnality. It was about connection, the same thing he had been starving for 5 long years. He did not send her away. He turned, and his hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her thick hair. He pulled her to him, and her mouth met his in a kiss that was fierce and hungry, a collision of two solitudes. It was a kiss of shared desperation, of defiance against the world that had cast them both out. But as the initial hunger subsided, something shifted. What began as a frantic, almost brutal claiming, softened. His hands, rough and calloused from a life of hard labor, became surprisingly gentle. He touched her face, her shoulders, her back, as if he were learning a new and precious language. He treated her not like a convenience, but like a discovery. And Maybelle, who had offered her body as a simple commodity, found herself utterly disarmed. She had expected roughness, a quick and anonymous transaction in the dark. She had not expected tenderness. She had not expected to be touched as if she were worth more than a few coins and a moment's release. As he held her, a single, hot tear escaped her eye. Then another. She began to weep, silently. Not from sadness, but from the shocking, painful, beautiful sensation of being treated as if she mattered. In the back room, a noise had woken Clara from a fitful sleep, a floorboard creaking. She had risen, thinking perhaps Eli was unwell. She crept to her door and pushed it open just a fraction of an inch. The moon had shifted, and a pale sliver of light now cut across the main room, illuminating Eli's cot. She saw them. She saw Maybelle's pale form kneeling, saw Eli's arm around her. She saw the kiss. A fire ignited in her chest, a hot, searing pain that took her breath away. It was a feeling so intense, so violent, she could not put a name to it. It was jealousy. Yes, but it was also a profound sense of betrayal, of loss, of a world tilting off its axis. She had wept in his arms only hours before, and now this. She backed away from the door, her hand clamped over her mouth to keep from crying out. She did not slam the door. She did not confront them. She crept back to her bed and slid beneath the covers, her body rigid, her eyes wide open in the darkness. The image of them burned into her mind. Her chest burned with a fire that had nothing to do with righteousness and everything to do with a woman's broken heart. The next day was an exercise in strained civility. Clara avoided looking at either of them, moving through her chores with a brittle, silent efficiency. Maybelle was subdued, her usual brazenness replaced by a quiet, watchful uncertainty. Eli was grim and silent, the weight of his actions heavy upon him. They were outside late in the afternoon, Eli chopping wood, Maybelle feeding the chickens, and Clara hanging laundry on a line, when a group of boys from the town appeared on the road. They had likely been dared, their courage bolstered by numbers. One of them, a lanky youth with a cruel mouth, picked up a rock. "There she is," he shouted, pointing at Maybelle. "The rancher's whore!" He threw the rock. It was a clumsy, inaccurate throw, and it skittered in the dust a few feet from Maybelle's feet. But the insult was as sharp as a shard of glass. Maybelle froze, her face hardening into a familiar mask of defiance. Eli dropped his axe and started toward them, a thunderous look on his face. But before either of them could react, something snapped in Clara. She dropped the laundry basket, marched over to the fence line, and fixed the boy with a stare so fierce it stopped him in his tracks. "You pick that up," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage. The boy just snickered. "What's it to you, widow? You sharing him?" "Her name is Maybelle Rose," Clara said, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. "She is a guest in this house, and you will show her respect, or I will fetch Mr. Sutton's shotgun and teach you a lesson in manners your mother clearly neglected." The boys, stunned by the ferocity of the quiet, pious widow, backed away, their jeers dying in their throats. They turned and scrambled back down the road toward town. Clara stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. Then she turned. Her eyes met Maybelle's across the yard. In that moment, the resentment and the jealousy were eclipsed by a flicker of something new, a grudging, reluctant, but undeniable alliance. They were outcasts together. A few days later, Eli began his project. He started clearing the ground a short distance from the main cabin, laying the foundations for a second, smaller structure. "What's that for?" Maybelle asked him. "For space," he said, not looking at her. "It's not right. All of us under one roof. It'll give you a proper place." He thought it was a solution, a way to restore some semblance of order and propriety. But he was wrong. Neither woman wanted distance. Maybelle began to find reasons to be in his bed every night, her initial plea turning into a quiet, desperate need. And Clara, in the evenings, began to sing. They were hymns, the sad, mournful songs of her faith. But she sang them with a strength and clarity that filled the cabin, an act of staking a claim that was as powerful as any physical touch. The tension deepened, a complex web of desire, resentment, and a strange, growing dependency. One night, another thunderstorm rolled in, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin. Eli, unable to sleep, got up to check on the livestock. When he came back inside, soaked from the rain, he found Clara sitting at the table, a blanket wrapped around her shivering shoulders. "The thunder," she said, her voice small. It frightens me." He sat down opposite her, in the flickering lantern light. She looked young and terribly vulnerable. "He never held me," she said suddenly, staring into the darkness. "My husband? Not like you did, not once." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness so deep it seemed bottomless. "I was a wife. I did my duty. But I have never been touched with love, only with duty." Her words were a confession of a life lived without warmth, without tenderness. Eli felt his heart ache for her. He got up, came around the table, and knelt before her. He took her cold hands in his. "I'm sorry," he said. He did not kiss her. He did not pull her into a passionate embrace. He simply took her into his arms, blanket and all, and held her. He held her as the thunder cracked and the rain beat against the roof. He held her as a friend, as a protector. He held her until her shoulders stopped shaking, and the storm inside her, for a little while, was quiet. And as he held the woman who craved his name, he knew, with a terrible, unshakable certainty, that his heart was as divided as his home. The fragile peace woven from shared sorrow and unspoken desire was not meant to last. Trouble in the high desert rarely came as a whisper. It arrived like a dust storm, sudden and blinding, choking the life out of everything in its path. It came in the form of a man named Jedediah Corman. Corman was a rancher whose holdings bordered Eli's to the east. He was a man whose ambition had long outstripped his acreage, a man who looked at the world and saw only things to be acquired. His own land was poor, his creek a seasonal trickle. He had long coveted the steady, year-round flow of Las Lloronas Creek, the lifeblood of Eli's ranch. For years, Eli's solitary, unshakable presence had been a silent deterrent. But now, Corman had a weapon. He had the scandal. He rode over one afternoon, flanked by two hard-faced ranch hands, his expensive saddle creaking a song of false prosperity. Corman was a thick-bodied man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He did not dismount, choosing to look down on Eli from the superiority of his saddle. "Sutton," he began, foregoing any pretense of neighborly greeting. "Heard you've got yourself a full house these days." He smirked, a greasy, unpleasant expression that made Eli's hands itch to form fists. "My house is my business, Corman," Eli said, his voice level and cold. "Is that a fact?" Corman shifted his weight, the leather groaning in protest. "See, some of us think it's the Lord's business. And the town's a man living in sin with two women. It brings a blight on the land. Makes a man wonder if you're fit to hold a claim, especially a claim with the best water rights in this whole valley." The threat was as plain as the sun in the sky. Corman was going to use the town's judgment as a lever to pry Eli's land from his hands. He was painting Eli as an unstable, immoral man, unfit to be a steward of the precious water. He would file a claim with the Territorial Land Office, citing moral turpitude, arguing that such a vital resource should belong to a more respectable, family-minded rancher, like himself. "You're trespassing, Corman," Eli said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Get off my land before I remove you." Corman's smirk widened. "This ain't over. Sutton, you've made yourself a target. You can't fight the whole world." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his laughter floating back on the wind, a foul and greedy sound. The world Corman spoke of was not slow to follow. A few days later, a formal delegation arrived. It was Pastor Davies again. But this time, he was not alone. He was accompanied by two of the church elders, Mr. Miller from the general store, and a grim-faced blacksmith named Josiah. They stood on the porch like a tribunal, their faces set in stone. "Eli Sutton," the pastor intoned, his voice resonating with the false thunder of the pulpit. "We, the council of the First Baptist Church of Las Lloronas Creek, have met and prayed on your situation. We cannot, in good conscience, Allow this den of iniquity to persist within our community without taking action." Clara stood in the doorway behind Eli, her face ashen, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. Maybelle watched from the barn, a pitchfork held loosely in her hand, her expression one of utter contempt. "Your household is an abomination." Mr. Miller piped in, his voice shrill with self-righteousness. "It is a cancer on the soul of this town. Therefore," Pastor Davies continued, raising his hand for silence, "we are here to deliver an ultimatum. You will be given 1 week, 7 days. By next Sunday, one of these women must be gone from this land. If, at the end of that week, both remain you, and any who choose to associate with you will be formally excommunicated. Your name will be struck from the church rolls. You will be denied Christian fellowship and, upon your death, Christian burial. Your souls will be cast out." The threat of excommunication was the most powerful weapon the church possessed. In a small, isolated community, it was a social death sentence. It meant complete and utter ostracism. No one would trade with you, speak to you, or aid you in times of trouble. You would become a ghost, a pariah. For a man like Eli, who had already turned his back on the town, it meant little. But for Clara, it was a vision of hell on earth. It was the final, formal severing of her last tie to the world of goodness and grace she so desperately craved. After the delegation departed, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the ranch. They ate their supper that night without a word, the clink of forks against plates the only sound. The food tasted like ash in their mouths, Corman's greed on one side, the church's judgment on the other. The walls were closing in. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floorboards. She did not look at Eli or Maybelle. She stared at a point on the far wall, her face pale but composed. "I will leave," she said, her voice a dead, emotionless monotone. "In the morning. It is the only way. I am the cause of this. It is my shame that has brought this upon you. I will not be the reason Mr. Sutton loses his land or his soul." It was the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, a return to the belief that she was the source of all misfortune, a burden to be shed. She was ready to walk back out into the desert, to disappear, to erase herself from their lives, to save them. "The hell you will!" a voice snarled from across the table. It was Maybelle. She was on her feet, her eyes blazing. "You sit down." Clara turned to her, her expression one of weary confusion. "There is no other choice." "There's always another choice," Maybelle shot back, her voice raw with a passion that startled them both. She jabbed a finger in Clara's direction. "You think you're so noble, don't you? Ready to wander off and die in a ditch to prove how pious you are. You think that makes you better than me? Well, it doesn't." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a fierce, possessive growl. "He ain't yours alone to save, and you ain't better than me." The words were a declaration of war, but also a declaration of belonging. In that moment, Maybelle was not fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for her place in their strange, broken triangle. She was refusing to be the disposable one, the sin that could be conveniently cast out. Eli, who had been sitting like a stone statue, finally moved. He pushed his chair back and stood, his gaze moving between the two women. The air in the cabin crackled, thick with years of unspoken resentments and months of tangled, confusing emotions. "Both of you, stop!" he said, his voice rough with the strain of a man pushed to his absolute limit. He looked from Clara's pale, tragic face to Maybelle's fierce, defiant one. He saw the goodness and the shame, the boldness and the fear. He saw two halves of a world he had never known he was missing. "It's not your fault, Clara," he said, his voice softening. "And it's not yours. Maybelle, it's mine. I'm the one who let you both stay. I'm the one who stood by while the town passed its judgment." He raked a hand through his hair, a profound weariness settling over him. He finally had to speak the truth, the whole, impossible, damning truth of his own heart. "I can't send either of you away," he confessed, the words tasting of relief and terror, "because I'm falling for you both." The confession hung in the air, stunning both women into silence. "I know how it sounds," he went on, his voice low and urgent. "It's madness. It's a sin, but it's the truth. One of you—" He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a deep, aching tenderness. "Wants my name, wants the goodness and the safety that comes with it. The other—" His gaze shifted to Maybelle, and it was filled with a raw, astonished admiration. "Wants my body, wants the honesty of the flesh, a way to forget the world for a while. But I want you both for more than that. I want Clara's quiet strength and her good heart, and I want Maybelle's fire and her fight. I want all of it. God help me. I want you both." For a long moment, no one moved. The truth of his words was too immense, too radical, to comprehend. Then the spell broke. Clara turned on Maybelle, her face a mask of anguish and fury. All the pent-up jealousy, all the nights she had lain awake listening, all the righteous indignation she had swallowed, erupted. "This is your fault," she cried, her voice shaking. "You came here with your shamelessness. You tempted him. You dragged him down into your sin." "My sin?" Maybelle laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "He was a ghost before I got here. And so were you. I'm the only one in this damn cabin who's been honest about what she wants. You hide behind your Bible and your baking, pretending you don't feel the same things I do. You're a liar. Clara, you judge me for wanting him in his bed, but you want him just the same. You just want the ring and the preacher's blessing to make it clean." "You are a vulgar, foul-mouthed harlot," Clara shrieked, her control finally shattering completely. "And you're a cold, pious fraud," Maybelle yelled back. It happened in an instant. Clara, the gentle, quiet woman who flinched at raised voices, lunged forward. Her hand flew through the air, and the sound of her palm connecting with Maybelle's cheek was a sharp, ugly crack that echoed in the small room. Maybelle staggered back, her hand flying to her face, her eyes wide with shock. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. Then, Maybelle's shock hardened into a cold, dangerous fury. She grabbed Clara's arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You don't ever," she hissed, her face inches from Clara's. "Touch me again." They stood there, locked in a stalemate of hatred and hurt, trembling with the force of their own emotions. Eli started to move between them, to pull them apart, but then he stopped. He saw the tears welling up in both of their eyes, tears of anger, of pain, of a profound, shared misery. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fight went out of them. Their grip loosened. They fell back from each other, their anger consumed by a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. They fell into silence. It was in that quiet, stripped bare by their own brutality, that something changed. The walls they had built against each other, walls of judgment and jealousy, crumbled into dust. They looked at each other, truly looked, and for the first time they saw not a rival, but a reflection of their own brokenness. Clara spoke first, her voice a raw, trembling whisper. She was not looking at Maybelle, but at the empty space between them. "He made me feel alive again," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "After my husband died, I was nothing. A ghost. He looked at me and saw a person. Then she lifted her gaze and met Maybelle's. You make me feel honest. You say the things I am too afraid to even think. You live without apology. I hate you for it, and I envy you for it." A single tear traced a path down Maybelle's cheek, the cheek that Clara had struck. "He was the first man who ever touched me like I was worth something," she said, her voice rough and low. "Like I was more than a bargain, more than a body." She looked at Clara, and the hardness in her eyes had melted away, replaced by a raw vulnerability. And you, with your bread and your mending and your prayers, you make me feel like I could be more than just a body, like there could be a part of me that's clean. The raw honesty of their confession stripped the last of the anger from the room, leaving only a fragile, aching truce. They had fought their way through the fire and come out the other side, burned and weary, but finally able to see each other clearly. Eli watched them, his heart aching with a love so fierce and so complicated it felt like it would break him in two. He had his answer. He could not choose. To choose one would be to cut out a part of his own soul. Days passed in a state of strange, suspended peace. The week given by the church was ticking away. The second cabin stood half-finished, a monument to a solution that no longer made sense. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the scrubland, Eli called them both outside. He stood before them, his face etched with the gravity of his decision. "The town has given us its verdict," he said, "and Corman has made his intentions clear. The world as it is has no place for us. So, we have to make our own world." He took a deep breath. "I meant what I said. I cannot choose between you. To do so would be a lie. So I am proposing something else. Not a marriage of law. The law would never allow it. The church would call it damnation. I am proposing a union of hearts. I want you both, not just in my bed, but in my life, at my table, by my fire. I want to build a life here, with both of you. But it will only work," he said, his gaze locking with each of them in turn, "if you'll have each other, as partners, as family." The proposition was so outlandish, so utterly against every rule of God and man they had ever known, that it seemed to hang in the air, a shimmering impossibility. Clara was the first to react. She took a step back, her hand flying to her throat as if to ward off a blow. "It's a sin," she whispered, her voice filled with a genuine, soul-deep horror. "It is a mortal sin. We would be damned for all eternity." Maybelle just stared at him for a long moment, and then she threw her head back and laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated disbelief, a laugh that was half sob. "Eli, you are the craziest son of a bitch I have ever met," she said, shaking her head. "Build a life? The three of us? They'll burn us out before the first winter. They'll run us out on a rail." He had expected their reactions. He had known they would resist. "Maybe," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But we'll face it together. What is our other choice? For you to leave, Clara, and face the world alone? For you to leave, Maybelle, and find another man who will treat you like dirt? For me to go back to being a ghost in an empty house? I won't do it." He did not press them for an answer. He simply stated his truth and let it stand. He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving them alone in the gathering twilight. Clara resisted the sin of it. Maybelle laughed at the sheer, beautiful absurdity of it. But neither woman packed her bags. Neither woman walked down the long, dusty track that led away from the ranch. They stayed. That night, a cold wind kicked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, sounding like the baying of wolves, or the jeering of a hostile town. A palpable fear settled in the small room. It was the fear of Corman's men in the dark, the fear of a town that had cast them out, the fear of the lonely, uncertain future. No one spoke of it, but the decision was made in silence. Clara did not go to her room. Maybelle did not go out to the barn. When Eli lay down on his cot, he felt the mattress dip on one side, and then the other. Clara lay on his right, Maybelle on his left. They were all fully clothed, their bodies rigid, separated by inches that felt like miles. This was not about lust. It was about survival. It was about a fear of the town's fire, both literal and metaphorical. It was a huddling together against the cold, dark night of the world's judgment. Eli reached out in the darkness, and his hands found theirs. He held them, one in each of his. He felt Clara's hand trembling violently. He felt Maybelle's hand, slick with a cold sweat. He held them tight, and in the darkness of the small, besieged cabin, the three of them lay there, holding on, a trinity of outcasts, daring to believe in something new. The night they spent huddled together for warmth and courage changed the composition of the air in the cabin. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the floorboards, but it was now overlaid with a fragile, tentative intimacy. They moved around each other in the morning with a new awareness, a shared secret held in the space between their bodies. Glances that had once been sharp with jealousy or suspicion were now softened with a kind of weary wonder. They had confessed their ugliest truths, and had not been destroyed. They had faced the specter of their own damnation and had chosen to face it together. But Jedediah Corman was not a specter. He was a man of flesh and blood and boundless greed. And he was not content to let the church fight his battles for him. The attack came 2 nights later, on a moonless, starless night when the darkness of the high desert was absolute. The first warning was a low, guttural growl from Jed, Eli's buckskin gelding in the corral, followed by a frantic, panicked barking from the stray dog that had adopted the ranch weeks before. Eli was awake in an instant, every instinct honed by the war screaming that something was wrong. He swung his legs off the cot, his hand reaching for the rifle that always leaned against the wall beside him.
"What is it?"
Clara whispered from the other side of the cot, her voice tight with fear. "Stay inside, both of you, and stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He moved to the window, peering into the inky blackness. He could see nothing, but he could feel them. A presence. The unnatural silence where there should have been the chirp of crickets. Suddenly, a torch flared to life near the barn. Then another and another, in their flickering, malevolent light. He saw them, a half-dozen figures on horseback, their faces obscured by bandanas. Corman's men. "They're going to burn us out," Maybelle breathed from behind him. She was no longer on the cot. In her hands, she held Eli's shotgun, its twin barrels glinting in the dim light from the hearth's embers. There was no fear on her face, only a cold, hard fury. "Get back from the window," Eli ordered, pulling her down. A rock crashed through the glass of the window, showering the floor with glittering shards. It was followed by a chorus of jeering, ugly laughter. "Come on out, Sutton. Send out your whores. We just want to be neighborly." Eli's face was a mask of cold rage. This was not a warning. It was an assault. They were not just trying to scare him. They were trying to break him. "Clara," he said, his voice sharp and clear. "The back window in your room. It's small, but you can get through it. Saddle Jed. He's the fastest. Ride for town. Get Sheriff Brody. Go now." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide with terror. "I can't leave you." "You must," he insisted. "It's the only way. We can hold them off for a while. But we need the law. Now, go!" For a moment, she hesitated. Then, a new, steely resolve hardened her features. She gave a single sharp nod, turned, and disappeared into her room. "Maybelle," Eli said, turning to her. "That shotgun is loaded with buckshot. It makes a fearsome noise. I'm going to open the door just a crack. When I do, fire both barrels into the air. Don't aim at them. Just make noise. Scare their horses." Maybelle's grip on the shotgun tightened. "I'd rather aim at them." "Not yet," he said. "Let's see how much courage they have when things get loud." He crept to the door, took a deep breath, and pulled it open a few inches. "Now!" Maybelle raised the shotgun and fired. The roar was deafening in the enclosed space, a blast of thunder and fire that ripped through the night. It was followed by a second, equally ferocious blast. Outside, the reaction was immediate. Horses screamed and reared, their riders cursing as they fought to control their panicked mounts. Eli used the confusion to his advantage. He raised his own rifle and fired, not at a man, but at the torch held by the nearest rider. The torch flew from the man's hand and sputtered out in the dirt. One of the other men, emboldened by anger, raised a pistol and fired wildly toward the cabin. Eli felt a searing, white-hot pain rip across his side, as if a hot poker had been laid against his ribs. He staggered back, a grunt of pain forced from his lips. "Eli!" Maybelle cried, rushing to his side. "I'm all right," he gasped, pressing a hand to his side. It came away wet and sticky. "It's just a graze. Keep them back from the house." He could hear the sound of hoofbeats, fast and frantic, fading into the darkness. Clara was away. Jed was a good horse. With luck, she would make it to town in under an hour. Now they just had to survive that long. The fight settled into a grim rhythm. The masked men, their courage shaken, kept their distance, circling the cabin like wolves. They would fire a shot, and Eli or Maybelle would return it. The flashes from their gun barrels, momentary bursts of light in the suffocating darkness. They were trapped in a stalemate, a waiting game. It felt like an eternity, but it was likely no more than an hour before they heard the sound they had been praying for, the thunder of multiple horses, riding hard from the direction of town. Corman's men heard it too. With a final volley of curses, they wheeled their horses and galloped away, melting back into the night from which they had come. A few minutes later, Sheriff Brody and 3 deputies rode into the yard. Brody was a man in his 50s, with a drooping mustache and weary, pouchy eyes that had seen too much. He was a man who preferred peace and quiet, and Eli's situation was anything but. The sheriff dismounted, his gaze taking in the scene, the broken window, the scorch marks on the barn wall where a torch had been thrown, the shotgun shells glinting on the porch. "Sutton," he said, his voice heavy with tired exasperation. "What in God's name is going on out here?" Eli, leaning against the doorframe, his shirt stained dark with blood, gestured vaguely into the night. "Corman's men, they tried to burn us out." Sheriff Brody sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. He looked at Eli's wound, at Maybelle standing in the doorway with the shotgun still in her hands, and then at Clara, who had just ridden in behind them, her face streaked with dirt and tears. He did not look at them with sympathy. He looked at them as one might look at a pack of stray dogs that were constantly causing trouble. "You got any proof it was Corman?" he asked. "They were masked," Eli said through gritted teeth. "But we all know who it was." "Knowing and proving are 2 different things," Brody said, shaking his head. "Eli, I'm going to be plain with you. The town is in an uproar over your situation here. People are saying you've brought this on yourself. Living the way you do, flaunting God's law. You can't expect folks to turn a blind eye." He was not offering justice. He was delivering a verdict. He was blaming the victims. "So you're not going to do anything?" Maybelle demanded, her voice dripping with scorn. "I'll ride over to Corman's place in the morning and have a talk with him," the sheriff said, avoiding her gaze. "But my advice to you is to end this. Send these women away. Restore some decency to this place. The trouble will stop when the sin stops." With that, he and his men mounted up and rode away, leaving them alone once more, the law having proven to be as hollow and unhelpful as the church's prayers. They went back inside, the smell of gunpowder and shattered glass hanging in the air. The adrenaline that had sustained them began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the throbbing reality of Eli's wound. "Let me see," Maybelle said, her voice soft but firm. She pushed Eli gently toward a chair by the fire. Clara hurried to fetch a basin of water and clean cloths. Maybelle carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The bullet had torn a shallow but vicious furrow along his ribs, leaving a raw, angry-looking wound that was still oozing blood. "It's not deep," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and tenderness. "But it needs to be cleaned and bound." She worked with a gentle, practiced efficiency, her hands surprisingly steady. As she washed the blood away, her fingers traced the network of old scars on his back and shoulders. Memories of the war etched into his skin. She stripped the rest of his tattered shirt away, leaving him bare-chested in the warm firelight. She did not look at him with lust, but with a fierce, profound sense of ownership. "This body belongs to us now," she whispered, her voice so low only he could hear it. "Every scar, every wound, we'll tend to it. We'll protect it." Just then, Clara came back into the main room. She had washed the dirt from her face, but her hair was still wild, and a long, ugly scratch ran down her cheek from a low-hanging branch she had ridden through in the dark. She looked not like a victim, but like a warrior returning from battle. She stopped and looked at the scene before her, Maybelle tending to Eli's wound, her hands moving with intimate care over his bare skin. The old Clara would have recoiled in shame and jealousy. But the woman who had ridden through the dark, who had faced down her fear and brought back a hollow justice, was not the old Clara. Her eyes met Eli's across the room. Her expression was one of fierce, unwavering resolve. "They will not drive us out," she said, her voice clear and strong, without a single tremor. "I will not run from them again." She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over Eli's wounded form. "They'll have to burn the whole desert before I leave him." The declaration was a vow, as sacred as any ever spoken in a church. In that moment, the last vestiges of their rivalry burned away, leaving only the pure, hard steel of their shared commitment. The next evening, after the broken window had been boarded up and a tense, watchful peace had returned, Eli did something that would seal their fate forever. He took a knife from the mantelpiece and knelt before the great stone hearth that was the heart of the cabin. The fire was burning low, casting a warm, gentle light on the three of them. He beckoned them closer. Clara knelt on his right, Maybelle on his left. He took both their hands in his grip firm and sure. Then, with the point of the knife, he began to scratch into the soft surface of the sandstone mantel. The sound of the steel against the stone was the only sound in the room. Slowly, 3 names appeared, carved deep into the rock, intertwined with each other. Eli, Clara Maybelle. He had given them his home. He had given them his heart. Now, he was giving them his name, etched into the very foundation of their world. It was a marriage certificate written in stone, a defiant testament to their union. That night, they returned to the same bed, but it was not fear that drew them there. It was a different kind of gravity, a pull of shared destiny, of a bond forged in fire and blood. Desire, which had been a source of tension and jealousy, was now a gentle, glowing ember in the center of their new world. Eli lay in the middle, his bandaged ribs aching. Maybelle lay on one side, Clara on the other. One of them would press a cool cloth to his forehead. The other would hold his hand. They took turns holding him, comforting him, their touches gentle and reverent. The desire between them all began to burn, not with the frantic heat of hunger, but with the slow, intense warmth of the hearth behind them. It was Eli who turned to Clara first. He touched her face, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. He saw the question in her eyes, the fear, the lifetime of guilt warring with a nascent, trembling want. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was not about taking, but about giving. It was a kiss of reassurance, of permission. He felt Maybelle's hand on his back, a silent, steady pressure of encouragement, and in the warm, safe darkness of their bed, surrounded by the 2 people who had become her world, Clara finally let go. She surrendered to her own body, to the feelings she had been taught to deny her entire life. She gave herself over to the act of love, not as a duty, but as a discovery. And when the pleasure came, it was so pure, so overwhelming. It broke through the dam of her long-held sorrow. She wept, not from pain or guilt, but from a shattering, brilliant joy. Maybelle, watching them in the dim firelight, saw the tears streaming down Clara's face. She saw the look of utter, astonished release on the other woman's face. and her own eyes filled with tears. She wept for Clara's newfound freedom, and for the beautiful, impossible love that had taken root in the most barren of soils. The next morning, the world felt new. The light filtering through the boarded-up window seemed softer. The air cleaner, a quiet, profound peace had settled in the cabin. They dressed for the day as if preparing for a ceremony. Maybelle put on a dress of vibrant, defiant red calico. Clara chose a simple dress of clean, linen white. She was no longer a widow in mourning gray. She was a bride, beginning a new life. When they were all gathered in the main room, Eli, moving stiffly, went to each of them. He kissed Clara first, a tender, lingering kiss on the lips. Then he turned and kissed Maybelle, a kiss of equal tenderness, equal love. He stood between them, his two wives, in their colors of purity and passion. "Good morning," he said, and for the first time in 5 years, his smile reached his eyes. But outside the stone walls of their small sanctuary, the world was spinning their story into a legend of depravity. The official notice of excommunication was nailed to the church door. Rumors, wild and explosive, spread like wildfire from town to town, and Jedediah Corman, furious that his thugs had failed, began to plot his next move, escalating the land war from one of covert violence to one of public, legal destruction. The lines had been drawn, their new world had been born, but the old world was not yet finished trying to destroy it. Jedediah Corman, having failed to drive them out with fire and fear, turned to the colder, crueler weapon of the law. A summons arrived, delivered by a grim-faced deputy who refused to meet anyone's eye. A stark white paper that felt as heavy as a tombstone. Corman was suing for primary access to the water of Las Lloronas Creek, citing Eli's morally derelict and unstable household as a threat to the responsible management of the territory's resources. But he had added a second, more personal cruelty. He had discovered the existence of Frank Miller's small inheritance, a few $100s and a deed to a worthless mining claim, and had filed a petition to have it placed under his own custodianship, arguing that Maybelle Rose, as a woman of loose morals and no proper male guardian, was unfit to manage her own affairs. He was attempting to strip them not only of their livelihood but of their dignity and autonomy. The trial was held in the territorial courthouse, a stuffy, wood-paneled room that smelled of stale cigar smoke, dust, and sanctimony. The entire town of Las Lloronas Creek seemed to be packed onto the hard wooden benches, their face a sea of morbid curiosity and harsh judgment. Pastor Davies and the church elders sat in the front row, a phalanx of righteousness. Corman sat beside his lawyer, a slick, paunchy man named Silas Croft, looking for all the world like a concerned citizen rather than a land-hungry predator. Eli, Clara, and Maybelle sat at a small table on the other side. They were an island in a hostile ocean. Eli was stiff and uncomfortable in a clean but worn suit he hadn't touched in years. Clara wore her simple linen white dress, her face pale but her expression serene, a silent testament to her own private vows. Maybelle, in her defiant red calico, looked every inch the scarlet woman the town imagined her to be, but her hands were steady in her lap, and her gaze was clear and unafraid. Their defender was a young lawyer, newly arrived in the territory, named Samuel Thorne. He was a thin, bookish man with spectacles and a quiet demeanor that belied a fierce, idealistic fire in his eyes. He had taken their case for next to nothing, intrigued by the legal questions it raised about individual liberty. Croft, Corman's lawyer, began by painting a lurid picture of life at the Sutton Ranch. He spoke of a den of carnality, a blight on their decent, God-fearing community, and an unholy triumvirate that mocks the sacred institution of marriage. He called witness after witness, Mr. Miller, Pastor Davies, Sheriff Brody, who all testified to the scandal and the disruption it had caused. They spoke as if Eli's home were a disease that threatened to infect them all. When it was Corman's turn to testify regarding the water rights, He spoke of community stability and the need for responsible stewardship, his voice dripping with false piety. He portrayed Eli as a man so consumed by lust that he could no longer be trusted to manage his own affairs, let alone a vital water source. Then Croft turned to the matter of Maybelle's inheritance. "We have here," he said, gesturing to Maybelle with a flourish of contempt, "a woman of no fixed address, no family, and no moral compass. To entrust her with even a modest inheritance would be irresponsible. It would surely be squandered on whiskey and sin. Mr. Corman, a pillar of this community, has generously offered to manage these funds on her behalf, to ensure they are not put to wicked use." When it was Samuel Thorne's turn, his approach was different. He did not challenge the town's morality. Instead, he challenged its right to impose that morality through law. His first witness was Maybelle Rose. She walked to the stand, her head held high, and took the oath. "Miss Rose," Thorne began gently. "Mr. Croft has painted a picture of you as a captive, a fallen woman being taken advantage of by Mr. Sutton. Is that how you see your situation?" Maybelle looked not at Thorne, but directly at the 12 men in the jury box, their faces a mixture of leeriness and condemnation. "No, sir, it is not," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "I came to this territory to be a wife and was met with a grave. I had nothing, no home, no money, no friends. The good people of Las Lloronas Creek," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, "offered me nothing but scorn. Eli Sutton offered me shelter. He did not demand a price. He did not force himself on me. He gave me a place to be safe." Croft jumped to his feet. "Objection. She is a resident in a house of ill repute. She is admitting to her part in this arrangement." "I am admitting," Maybelle shot back, her voice rising, "that I am part of Eli Sutton's household by my own free will. It is my choice. He has never laid a hand on me in anger, never spoken a cruel word. He has treated me with more kindness and respect than any man I have ever known. You talk about my inheritance? It is mine. Frank Miller left it to me. It is not Mr. Corman's to manage. And it is not this court's to steal. It is mine, and my life is my own to live." She left the stand in a stunned silence. Thorne then called his second witness, Clara Mercer. Clara moved to the stand with a quiet grace that seemed to rebuke the ugliness of the proceedings. "Mrs. Mercer," Thorne said, his voice soft. "You are a God-fearing woman, are you not?" "I am, sir," Clara replied. "And yet you remain in Mr. Sutton's home, an arrangement your own pastor has deemed an abomination. Why?" Clara looked at the pastor, then at the jury, and finally, her gaze came to rest on Eli. A faint, soft smile touched her lips. "Because I was an outcast," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My husband's death left me with nothing but a name full of shame. The church, my family, they all turned their backs. I came to Mr. Sutton's ranch expecting nothing more than a place to sleep out of the wind. He gave me a home. He gave me back my dignity. Mr. Croft and these other men speak as if we are Mr. Sutton's property, 2 women he has collected for his own wicked purposes." She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom, firm and unwavering. "He never owned us. We chose him." The simple, powerful truth of her words settled over the room. Before Croft could even think to object, she was finished. In his closing argument, Samuel Thorne spoke not of love or sin, but of freedom. "What Mr. Corman and his counsel are asking you to do," he said to the judge and jury, "is to legislate private morality. They are asking you to use the law to punish a man not for any crime he has committed against another citizen, but because his personal life does not conform to their own beliefs. Eli Sutton has not stolen from anyone. He has not harmed anyone. He has provided shelter and protection to 2 women who were alone and destitute. The nature of their household is a matter for their own consciences and for their God, not for a court of law. The territory was founded on the principle that people could come here to build a new life, free from the rigid doctrines they left behind. Are we to abandon that principle now? These 3 consenting adults have chosen to build a life together. It may be unconventional. It may be strange to our eyes. But is it unlawful? The judge was an old man named Harrison, a territorial circuit judge who had seen everything from claim jumpers to cattle rustlers. He was a practical man, more concerned with order than with theology. He listened to all the arguments, his expression unreadable. After the jury delivered a hopelessly divided verdict, the decision fell to him. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tense room. "This court is not a church," he began, his voice a gravelly rumble. "It is not my place to rule on the state of a man's soul." He looked at Corman, a flicker of distaste in his eyes. "Regarding the water rights, no evidence has been presented that Mr. Sutton has mismanaged his claim or failed in his duties as a landowner. The petition is denied." A gasp went through the crowd. Corman's face turned purple. "Regarding the inheritance of Miss Rose," the judge continued, "it is a private matter between her and the estate of the deceased. This court finds no grounds to appoint a custodian. That petition is also denied." Maybelle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand finding Clara's under the table. "Finally," the judge said, looking directly at Eli, Clara, and Maybelle, "we come to the matter of the household itself. The law of this territory is clear. A man may have only one wife." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "What you have built is not a marriage in the eyes of the law. However," he continued, holding up a hand to quell the murmurs, "Mr. Thorne raises a salient point. There is no law in the books that explicitly forbids your current living arrangement. You have broken no criminal statute. Therefore, while I cannot, and do not, condone it, I am also unable to condemn it. Your marriage may not be of law, but I cannot call it unlawful." He banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." They had won. It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was a victory nonetheless. The law, in its own clumsy way, had agreed to leave them alone. They walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun, the town parting before them like the Red Sea. The whispers followed them, but they were different now. The town was divided. For some, like the pastor and his flock, the judge's ruling was a sign of the coming apocalypse. They would forever be the residents of the Devil's Ranch. But for others, a seed of doubt had been planted. They had seen the fierce loyalty of the 2 women, had heard the quiet dignity in their voices. They had seen a man refuse to bow to pressure. Some began to wonder if love, like water, could find its own path, even through the hardest rock. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. The half-finished second cabin was abandoned. Instead, they began to build onto the main house. Together, Eli, with his strong back, laid the new foundations and raised the log walls. Maybelle, surprisingly tireless, hauled rocks and mixed mud for the chinking, her laughter now a frequent and welcome sound. Clara, with her eye for comfort and order, planned the interior, directing the placement of windows to catch the morning light and the layout of shelves for her pantry. They were building more than a house. They were building a home, a physical manifestation of their new family. The new structure had 3 rooms branching off the main one, each with its own door, offering privacy if it was wanted. But more often than not, they found themselves together in the main room, around the single, large table Eli had built. And at night, they still shared the one wide bed before the hearth, a space of warmth and love, no longer born of fear, but of a deep and abiding affection. They worked the land with a shared, dogged determination. They expanded Clara's garden until it was overflowing with vegetables. They bought a milk cow and a flock of chickens. And the ranch, once a place of stark, masculine silence, was now filled with the sounds of life. They sold their surplus eggs and butter in a neighboring town where their reputation had not yet preceded them. They worked from sunup to sundown, Their persistence a silent answer to the town's judgment. Respect, they learned, was not given freely. It was earned, one season at a time. They did not earn it through compliance, but through endurance. The first sign of a thaw came nearly a year later. A wagon rattled up their track, driven by a widow from a small ranch a few miles north. A woman named Agnes. Her face was etched with worry. Her 16-year-old daughter, she explained, had run away, fed up with the hard life and her mother's strict rules.
I heard,
Agnes began, twisting a corner of her apron in her hands.
I heard you took in folks who had nowhere else to go. My Sarah, she's a good girl, but she's headstrong.
If she turns up here, would you give her work?
Just until I can talk some sense into her. I'd rather she was here than somewhere else.
It was a quiet revolution. A mother, a respectable widow, was entrusting her runaway daughter to the care of the Devil's Ranch. She was choosing their unconventional kindness over the dangers of the unknown world. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. Change was beginning, not with a roar, but with a quiet knock on their door. Time passed. The harsh lines of judgment in the territory began to soften. Their story became less a scandal and more a piece of local folklore, a strange desert flower that had bloomed against all odds. One warm spring morning, 2 years after the trial, the world felt soft and new. The air smelled of rain-washed sage and blooming claret cup cactus. Clara and Maybelle stood in the doorway of their new home, watching the sun climb over the distant mesas. An easy, comfortable silence lay between them, without a word. Clara reached out and took Maybelle's hand, her fingers lacing through hers. Maybelle squeezed back gently. They stood there, linen white and calico red, a portrait of a love that had defied every definition. In the distance, they saw Eli riding in from the fields, his morning chores complete. He saw them in the doorway, saw their joined hands, and a broad, open smile lit up his face. He rode up to the porch, dismounted, and came to them. He looked at Clara, his eyes full of a deep, quiet love, and he kissed her. Then he turned to Maybelle, his gaze full of an equal, fiery affection, and he kissed her. There was no shame, no hesitation. It was as natural as the sun rising in the east, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. Later that day, as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, Eli took out his knife once more. He knelt at the hearth, where their names were carved into the stone. Clara and Maybelle knelt with him, their shoulders touching. Beneath the 3 names, he carefully, lovingly, carved one new word, a word that held the sum of all their trials, all their sorrows, and all their joy. A word that had finally come to define them. Home. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And we invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.